The slap came out of nowhere. 1 second, the first-class cabin of Flight 1147 was quiet. The next, the sound of a palm cracking across a man's face silenced every conversation, every cough, every whispered word at 37,000 feet. Passengers gasped. Phones came up. Nobody stopped it. The man didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't even raise his voice. He just looked up slowly and reached for his phone. What happened in the next 5 minutes would cost 4 people their careers, shake an entire airline to its foundation, and prove one brutal truth: you never ever assume you know who's sitting in front of you. Drop a comment right now. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. You will not want to miss what comes next. Daniel Harmon had not slept in 41 hours. That wasn't a complaint. It was just a fact. The kind of fact that a man holds quietly in his chest when he doesn't have anyone left to tell it to. His wife Claire had been gone for 14 months. 14 months, 3 weeks. And if he was being precise about it, and Daniel Harmon was always precise, 6 days. The grief hadn't softened. It had just changed shape. In the beginning, it was a wave. Relentless, suffocating, pulling him under before he could catch his breath. Now, it was more like a stone he carried. Heavy always there, but at least he knew where it was. What made it bearable, the only thing that made it bearable, was the 7-pound 4-ounce reason currently asleep against his chest. His son. Noah. 4 months old. Dark wisps of hair. A tiny fist curled around Daniel's thumb, even in sleep, like the boy knew even unconsciously that letting go was not an option. Daniel had dressed simply for the flight. Dark jeans. A plain gray Henley. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. He looked by any reasonable measure like a tired young father traveling alone with an infant, which is exactly what he was. No suit. No briefcase. No visible marker of anything other than exhaustion and quiet love. He had booked the first-class seat specifically for the extra space. Noah had been colicky the past 2 weeks, and Daniel knew from painful experience that a cramped seat in economy with a fussing infant was a recipe for misery for him, for Noah, and for every passenger within 6 rows. First class gave him room to stand, to sway, to walk the small aisle if he needed to. He'd paid for the seat out of his own pocket, same as anyone. Flight 1147, non-stop from Atlanta to Los Angeles. Departure, 8:15 a.m. The cabin was perhaps a third full in first-class 11 passengers spread across the wide leather seats, the kind of people who traveled this way regularly. A woman in her 60s with a silk scarf and reading glasses. 2 men in business suits already deep in their laptops. A young couple who held hands and whispered to each other like the flight was a honeymoon extension. Daniel had settled into seat 3A with Noah, nestled in the crook of his left arm. He'd packed with military precision bottle in the right side pocket of the diaper bag burp cloth accessible pacifier on a clip attached to Noah's onesie. Everything within reach. Everything accounted for. He was not the kind of man who was unprepared. The first hour passed without incident. Noah slept. Daniel closed his eyes, not quite sleeping but resting in that shallow, vigilant way that all new single parents learn: one ear always open, always listening. It was when Noah woke hungry, and announcing it with the particular urgency that only a 4-month-old can produce, that things began to unravel. "Okay, buddy," Daniel murmured, already reaching for the pre-made bottle he'd stored in the seat pocket. I got you. He shifted Noah upright, slid the bottle into position, and Noah latched immediately, the crying cutting off like a switch had been flipped. Daniel exhaled. Passengers nearby who had tensed at the crying relaxed visibly. That was when Sandra Kowalski appeared. She was the lead flight attendant for the first-class cabin, late 40s, sharp-featured with the kind of practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd been professional enough in the boarding process, courteous in the rote, distant way of someone who'd done this job long enough to stop seeing passengers as people. She moved down the aisle with the confident ownership of someone on her territory. She stopped at row 3. "Sir," Her voice carried just enough edge to signal this wasn't a friendly check-in. Daniel looked up from Noah. Yes. We've had a complaint from another passenger. She tilted her head slightly, her expression suggesting the complaint was in her view entirely valid. About the noise. A pause. Your child has been disturbing the cabin. Daniel looked around. The passengers he could see were not in fact disturbed. The businessman in 2B hadn't even looked up from his screen. The woman with the silk scarf was still reading. He was crying for about 45 seconds, Daniel said, keeping his voice level and quiet. He's 4 months old. He was hungry. He's fine now. Sir, this is a first-class cabin. Our passengers expect a certain... I'm also a first-class passenger, Daniel said, still calm. Seat 3A, booked and paid for. Something shifted in Sandra Kowalski's expression. A tightening around the eyes, a slight lift of the chin. I understand that, she said, and her tone made clear she understood it, but didn't particularly accept it. However, if your child continues to disrupt the flight, we may need to discuss alternative arrangements. Alternative arrangements, Daniel repeated slowly. Yes. For a 4-month-old on a 6-hour flight. For the comfort of all passengers, sir. Daniel looked at her for a long, quiet moment. He was tired. He was grieving. He was doing the best he could with everything he had, and the best he had right now was a clean bottle and a settled baby and a first-class seat he'd paid for. He's eating, Daniel said simply. He'll go back to sleep. There's no issue. Sandra's jaw tightened. She seemed to make a decision. I'll be checking back, she said, with the weight of a warning. She moved away down the aisle, and Daniel returned his attention to Noah. The boy had already finished half the bottle, his eyes drifting closed again with the contented heaviness of a full stomach. You're doing great, buddy, Daniel whispered. Doing just great. 20 minutes passed. Noah finished his bottle, burped a remarkably loud one for someone his size, which made the man in 4C stifle a laugh and settled into sleep against Daniel's shoulder. Daniel rubbed slow circles on the boy's back and let himself breathe. He should have known it wasn't over. Sandra Kowalski came back. This time she had company. A man Daniel hadn't noticed before, a passenger not crew wearing an expensive polo shirt, and the particular expression of someone who had appointed himself an authority on situations he had no authority over. He was perhaps 55, ruddy-faced, thick through the shoulders, and he was standing just behind Sandra with his arms crossed. This is the passenger I mentioned, Sandra said, gesturing toward Daniel with the kind of detached, clinical precision a zookeeper might use when identifying an animal. The man in the polo, Daniel, would later learn his name was Gerald Mitch, a frequent flyer with a premium membership, and the disposition of someone who believed those two facts gave him significant moral weight. In most situations, looked at Daniel with open contempt. You need to keep that thing quiet, Gerald said. Daniel felt something cold move through him. That thing. Excuse me, he said quietly. You heard me. People up here paid for peace and quiet. If you can't control your kid, maybe you should be in economy with the rest of... Gerald paused, seemed to recalibrate slightly under Daniel's level gaze, then finished, with everyone else. Gerald. Sandra said, not quite a reprimand, more like she was managing the scene stage directing. My son. Daniel said each word deliberate and clear, is asleep. He has been asleep for 20 minutes. I'm not sure what problem you're perceiving, but there isn't one. There was a problem, Gerald said. That screaming. He cried for less than a minute. He's an infant. I don't care what he is. Gerald. Sandra's voice sharpened slightly, then softened as she turned back to Daniel. Sir, I want to keep this situation calm, for everyone's comfort. Is there something we can do to make this easier? Perhaps you'd prefer a different seat in the rear of the aircraft. You're asking me to move to coach, Daniel said. He wasn't asking. He was naming what was happening. I'm offering a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Sandra's smile stayed in place, but something behind her eyes went hard and flat. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice." "I haven't raised it." "Sir, I haven't raised my voice once." He hadn't. Every word had come out at the same measured, quiet pitch. But he could hear his own heartbeat now fast and insistent in his ears. "I am in my seat. My son is asleep. I have done nothing to warrant any of this. Sir, I'm asking you to cooperate. And I'm asking you to explain specifically what policy I'm violating, because I'd like to know." Gerald made a sound in the back of his throat, discussed impatience, and muttered something under his breath. Daniel didn't quite catch it. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Sandra straightened. She looked at Daniel for a moment the way a person looks at a door they've decided to force open. "Sir, I'm going to need you to—" And then she reached out. What happened next took less than 2 seconds, and those 2 seconds would be replayed, debated, and dissected for months. Sandra Kowalski's right hand came up and came forward and connected open-palmed with the left side of Daniel Harmon's face. The sound was sharp and flat and horrible in the pressurized air of the cabin. Crack! Noah's eyes flew open. His face crumpled immediately, the sudden shock translating directly into a wail. Daniel's head had snapped to the right with the impact. For a single suspended moment, nobody in the cabin moved. Then chaos. Not loud chaos. Not the chaos of a fight breaking out. But the chaos of 20-something people in a confined space, processing something that had just shattered the invisible agreement that governed every flight. The agreement that things were orderly, that authority figures were measured, that the cabin was safe. Phones appeared. Immediately, without hesitation. 4 of them, 5 recording. The businessman in 2B finally looked up. The woman with the silk scarf lowered her book. The young couple held each other's hands tighter. Daniel sat perfectly still. His cheek was burning. He could feel it, a sharp spreading heat that pulsed with his heartbeat. Noah was crying against his chest, frightened by the sound and the sudden tension, and Daniel's arm tightened around his son, instinctively, protectively. He turned his face back toward Sandra Kowalski. She was standing rigid, her hands still partially raised, and there was a look on her face that Daniel would remember for a long time, not remorse, not horror at what she'd done, but a kind of stunned satisfaction. Like she'd been wanting to do that since the moment she'd first approached his seat. Gerald behind her let out a low, approving sound. From the row across the aisle, a woman's voice. "Well, he was being difficult." Another voice, a man toward the back of first class. "She shouldn't have done that. That's assault." "He was bothering everyone," the first woman countered. Daniel closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Not in pain, though there was pain. In something more deliberate. Something that looked from the outside almost like a man deciding something. Then he opened his eyes. "Ma'am," he said to Sandra Kowalski. His voice was absolutely, completely, terrifyingly calm. "Please step back." Sandra blinked. She had Daniel could see expected tears, or rage, or threats. The calm unnerved her visibly. "Sir, if you just step back," he said again. Not louder, just final. She stepped back. Daniel shifted Noah to his right arm, still murmuring low, reassuring sounds to settle the boy. With his left hand, he reached into the seat pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't call 911. He didn't call a lawyer. He opened his contacts, scrolled to a name, and pressed call. Sandra watched him. Gerald watched him. Half the cabin watched him. Some of them still recording, some of them already narrating into their cameras. So this guy was causing trouble, and the flight attendant finally... Daniel lifted the phone to his ear. It rang once. "Daniel?" The voice on the other end was immediately awake, immediately focused. It was Christine Yao, his executive vice president of operations, who had in 8 years of working for him, never once failed to pick up on the first ring. "Christine," Daniel said, "I need you to pull up the manifest for Flight 1147 Atlanta to Los Angeles. Departing this morning." A beat. He could hear Christine already moving, already typing. "I've got it. I need the full crew roster. Lead flight attendant and the flight deck. Another beat shorter this time. Lead FA is Sandra Kowalski. Captain is William Hadley. First Officer James Ruiz. Thank you. Daniel lowered the phone for a moment and looked directly at Sandra Kowalski, who had gone very, very still. Sandra Kowalski. She blinked. How do you know my... And Captain Hadley. Daniel raised the phone back to his ear. Christine, I need you to contact the operations center and arrange for a full crew replacement to meet Flight 1147 at LAX. Ms. Kowalski and Captain Hadley are to be relieved of duty upon landing. I also need HR Legal and our head of security operations on a conference call in 30 minutes. A pause from Christine. Not surprise, she was past surprising, but something careful and precise in her voice. Understood. Do you want me to coordinate your disclosure now or on the ground? On the ground, Daniel said. But flag everything. I want documentation of this flight from gate to gate, all cabin cameras, crew communications, passenger manifests. Everything. It's done, Christine said. Are you all right? He glanced down at Noah, who had quieted now, his tiny fist wrapped again around Daniel's thumb, his eyes heavy. We're fine, Daniel said quietly. Thank you, Christine. He ended the call. The cabin was silent. Not the polite ambient silence of a normal flight. A different kind of silence, the kind that fills a room when everyone in it has just recalibrated something fundamental. Sandra Kowalski had not moved. Her face had changed. The satisfaction was gone. Something beneath it had surfaced uncertainty, and beneath that, the first tremor of something that might in another hour become genuine fear. I don't understand, she said. Her voice had lost its authority. It was thinner now. Who are you? My name, Daniel said, is Daniel Harmon. He said it quietly. He said it the way a man says something he's said thousands of times in thousands of rooms and never needed to say loudly because the name itself had always been enough. Gerald from behind Sandra made a sound. Not the approving sound from before, something different. He'd pulled out his own phone and his expression had shifted from contempt to something pale and calculating. The woman across the aisle who had said Daniel was being difficult had gone very quiet. Daniel looked around the cabin once, not confrontationally, not triumphantly, just taking stock. Then he looked back down at his son. It's okay, Noah, he said softly. Go back to sleep. And Noah, because he trusted his father, completely closed his eyes. Sandra Kowalski's hands had begun to shake. She didn't know why not fully, not yet. The name meant something she could feel, that the way you can feel a shift in air pressure before a storm, but she couldn't place it precisely. She was still standing in the aisle of her cabin, the cabin she'd worked for 11 years, and the ground beneath her felt suddenly unreliable. Harmon, she repeated almost to herself. Then louder with effort, Sir, I don't see how that changes. Sandra. His voice stopped her. It wasn't unkind. It was something worse. It was final. You struck a passenger, in front of witnesses, with recording devices actively running, on a flight that has full cabin camera coverage. He paused. I suggest you contact your union representative at the earliest opportunity. Her mouth opened, closed. From 3 rows back, someone let out a low whistle. Gerald Mitch, who had been furiously typing into his phone, looked up from his screen. Whatever he'd found there had drained the ruddy color from his face. Because SkyPoint Airways was not a small regional carrier. It was not a mid-tier operation with a few dozen aircraft and a modest route map. SkyPoint Airways was the 4th largest airline in the United States. 38,000 employees, 214 aircraft. Hubs in Atlanta, Denver, and Phoenix. And its CEO, the man who had built it, who had taken it from a regional carrier on the verge of bankruptcy to a major player in 12 years, was Daniel Harmon, who was 39 years old, who had appeared on the cover of Forbes twice, who was, as of this moment, sitting in seat 3A of Flight 147 in a gray Henley with his 4-month-old son asleep on his chest. Gerald lowered his phone slowly. The woman across the aisle who had sided so quickly with Sandra had found her window very, very interesting. Daniel was not looking at any of them. He was looking out his own window at the flat, white expanse of cloud below 37,000 feet of open air between them and the ground, and his expression was one that people who knew him well would have recognized immediately. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more durable than either. He was thinking. Carefully and completely. The way he thought about everything. On his chest, Noah breathed in and out with the perfect, untroubled rhythm of the entirely innocent. The plane flew on, and Sandra Kowalski stood in the aisle of the cabin she had owned for 11 years and felt the slow, terrible dawning of consequences. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see where this story is traveling. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. Part 2 is where everything changes. The silence that followed Daniel's phone call had a texture to it. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a cabin full of people minding their own business at cruising altitude. It was the kind of silence that happens after something irreversible. The kind where everyone is very carefully not looking at the person they most want to look at, and thinking very hard about whether the thing they said 3 minutes ago is the kind of thing that could be traced back to them. Sandra Kowalski had not moved from the aisle. She was still standing there, and the longer she stood without speaking, the more exposed she looked, like someone who had walked confidently onto a stage and then discovered too late that the play had changed, and she didn't know her lines anymore. Daniel didn't look at her. He was focused on Noah adjusting the light blanket he'd tucked around the boy's legs, making sure the air vent above wasn't blowing directly on him. Small, deliberate acts of fatherhood that were in their absolute ordinaries, more devastating to Sandra's composure than any confrontation could have been. Finally, she found her voice. "Mr. Harmon." The formality was new. It came out stiff, assembled hastily from pieces. I think there may have been a misunderstanding about what just... Sandra. He didn't look up from Noah. "I think you should go do your job." "I just want to clarify." "Your job," he said again gently. "There are other passengers on this flight." She stood there for another 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked with great deliberate composure toward the galley at the front of the cabin. The moment she disappeared behind the partition, the cabin exhaled. Gerald Mitch, who had been frozen in the aisle 2 steps behind where Sandra had been standing, now found himself conspicuously alone and visible. He cleared his throat. He looked at the floor. He looked at his phone. He looked at the floor again. Then he walked without saying a single word back to his seat in row 5 and sat down with the careful precision of a man trying very hard not to exist. The woman across the aisle from Daniel, the one who had said he was being difficult, had her reading tablet up in front of her face. The screen, Daniel noticed peripherally, had not changed pages in several minutes. From row 4, a man's voice, the one who had said earlier that the slap wasn't right. "You good, brother?" Daniel looked over. The man was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd said the right thing when it would have been easier not to. Daniel appreciated that. "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. "We're good. Thank you." The man nodded once, the solid, uncomplicated nod of someone who'd seen enough of the world to know when a thing was wrong and say so. Then he went back to his book. Daniel looked down at Noah. The boy was deeply asleep now, that boneless, total sleep that infants fall into like it's a vocation. His chest rose and fell. His little mouth was slightly open. There was a small milk bubble at the corner of his lip that Daniel carefully wiped away with the edge of the burp cloth. He felt the burning in his cheek, still a steady pulsing heat that he knew would leave a mark visible for days. His jaw was tight. He made a conscious effort to release it. He had been hit before in his life. Not often. Once in a parking garage in his 20s during a mugging that had gone sideways. once during a pickup basketball game in college where things got out of hand. Both times there had been adrenaline and confusion and the messy aftermath of physical confrontation. This was different. This was a woman in a uniform striking him in a cabin at 37,000 feet because she had decided based on something she thought she saw when she looked at him that she could, that he would accept it, that the cost of doing it was essentially nothing. He was very, very clear on what that meant, and he was very, very clear on what he was going to do about it. He reached into the diaper bag and pulled out a small leather notebook, the kind he'd carried for 15 years, the same model repurchased whenever one filled up. He opened it to a fresh page and uncapped a pen and began to write. Not typing writing, the way he always documented things that mattered. Time, seat number, names, sequence of events. Exact words as precisely as he could reconstruct them. The names of the passengers he'd heard speak noted by seat position. The number of phones he'd observed recording. The specific physical contact open palm, left cheek force, sufficient to cause head rotation. He wrote for 7 minutes without stopping. In the galley, Sandra Kowalski was not doing her job. She was standing with her back against the counter, arms crossed tight across her chest, staring at the partition wall. Beside her was Kevin Marsh, the second flight attendant for the first-class cabin, mid-30s, slender, with the perennial expression of a man who had learned over many flights to stay out of Sandra's way. He was not staying out of her way now. He was looking at her with wide, careful eyes. "Sandra," he said, barely above a whisper. "What happened out there?" "I handled a disruptive passenger," she said. "You hit him." She stopped, started again. I made contact, Sandra." Kevin's voice was low and urgent. "I saw it. Everyone saw it. There were phones out the second it happened. And now he's Sandra. Who is that guy?" "Because whatever you just said to him on the phone, I didn't say anything to him." "Whatever he said on his phone." "Because Jennifer from Economy just texted me." He held up his own phone. "And she says the name going around is Daniel Harmon. She says somebody Googled it and Kevin. Sandra." He turned his phone to face her. She looked at the screen for a long moment. The Forbes article was 3 years old, but the photo was unmistakable. The same face, younger and clean-shaven, but the same eyes, the same particular quality of stillness in them. Daniel Harmon, 36. The quiet architect of Sky Point's resurgence. Sandra's arms tightened across her chest. "It might not be him," she said. Kevin stared at her. "Sandra. People have the same names." He called his EVP of operations by name, and she pulled a crew manifest in 30 seconds. Kevin lowered his phone. "You know what that means. You know exactly what that means." She did know. She had worked for Sky Point Airways for 11 years. She had flown through 3 ownership changes, 2 merger attempts, and 1 catastrophic labor negotiation that had taken 6 months and left relationships on the crew floor permanently fractured. She knew what the org chart looked like. She knew where the name Daniel Harmon sat on it. At the top. Completely alone at the top. He was disrupting the cabin, she said, but the conviction had bled almost entirely out of the words. They sat there between her and Kevin, thin and unconvincing. "His baby cried for a minute," Kevin said. "That's it. That's what happened. And Gerald Mitch." He shook his head. "Gerald complained to you, and you went over there and you—" He stopped himself. "Sandra, I've watched you do this before. Not what you just did, but the way you look at certain passengers, the way you decide before they open their mouths what category they go in." Sandra's jaw tightened. "Don't. I'm not judging you. I'm telling you what I've watched happen. And this time—" "Don't," she said again, and this time it landed harder. "Cut the conversation off at the knees." Kevin stepped back. He looked at her for a moment, his expression not angry, something sadder and more complicated than anger. "I'm going to go check on the economy passengers," he said. "And when we land Sandra, I'm going to tell the truth about what I saw. I want you to know that now, not to threaten you. because you deserve to know it's coming." He moved past her and through the galley door. Sandra stood alone. She picked up her phone and stared at it. She needed to call someone. Her union rep. Her attorney, if she had one. She'd paid dues into the legal defense fund for years and never imagined needing it. She needed to tell someone what happened before the version she couldn't control got everywhere first. But her hands weren't doing what she told them to. She was thinking about the look on his face when she'd done it, not what she'd expected. No explosion of outrage. No wounded pride. Just that awful measuring stillness. Like he was cataloging everything. Like he already knew exactly what was going to happen next and was simply deciding how to proceed. She'd worked this cabin for 11 years. She'd developed instincts, she told herself. She'd learned to read people, to know who needed firm handling and who needed gentle coaxing, and who could be managed before things got out of hand. She had looked at Daniel Harmon, tired, unshaven in his plain gray shirt, holding his infant, and she had put him in a category. Quickly, automatically, without question. Standing alone in the galley now, she thought about that. She thought about it for a long time. Captain William Hadley had been flying commercial for 26 years. He had a reputation that was by any measure a good one, steady, unflappable. The kind of captain who could hit a runway in a crosswind without waking the sleeping passengers, and who ran his flight deck with a calm that his first officers tended to describe in their evaluations as reassuring. He was in the middle of a routine fuel efficiency check with First Officer James Ruiz when the call came through from the ground. It wasn't unusual to receive calls from operations during flight. Reroutes happened. Gate changes happened. Medical situations happened. He picked up with the same steady neutrality he brought to everything. "Captain Hadley, this is Christine Yao, EVP of Operations at Sky Point." He sat up slightly. EVPs did not call flight decks directly. "Ms. Yao," he said carefully, "I'm calling regarding an incident in your first-class cabin that occurred approximately 40 minutes into your flight. A physical altercation involving one of your crew members and a passenger." Hadley's eyes went briefly to Ruiz, who was listening without appearing to listen. "I haven't received a report from the cabin." "You will," Christine said. "I'm calling to inform you that when you land at LAX, you'll be met by a member of our security operations team and an HR representative. At that time, you'll be asked to provide a full account of any communications you received regarding the incident and the actions you took or declined to take in response." "I wasn't informed of any incident, Captain." Her voice stayed professional, but something in its texture changed. "I want to be very straightforward with you. The passenger involved is Daniel Harmon. He called me directly from his seat. I've already begun the documentation process. If you received any communication from your crew regarding the situation and did not take action, that will be part of the review." William Hadley had been flying for 26 years, and he was, as his first officers always noted, unflappable. He sat very still in the left seat of his 737 at cruising altitude and felt for perhaps the first time in a long time the particular sensation of the ground shifting beneath him. "I understand," he said. "Thank you, Captain. Have a safe flight." The line went dead. James Ruiz was looking at his instruments, very intently, with total focus, the way someone focuses on something irrelevant when they've just overheard something enormous. "Don't," Hadley said quietly. "I didn't say anything," Ruiz said. "I know." Hadley set the handset back in its cradle. "Pull up the cabin log. I want to know if there's anything from Kowalski in the last hour." Ruiz pulled it up. There was a note flagged as routine from 15 minutes into the flight. "Passenger complaint in first-class situation managed." "Managed," Hadley said. He looked at the word for a moment. Then he reached for the intercom. Sandra's phone buzzed. Captain's line. She answered it. "Sandra." Hadley's voice was stripped of everything except weight. "I just received a call from operations. From Christine Yao." The galley felt very small suddenly. "Okay," Sandra said. "Tell me exactly what happened." She told him, or she told him the version that began with a legitimate passenger complaint and a disruptive infant and a tense exchange that had escalated. She left out the category she'd put him in. She left out the specific words she'd used. She described the physical contact as instinctive a reaction, not quite the way it actually was. Hadley listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Sandra, the passenger is Daniel Harmon." She said nothing. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes," she said very quietly. "You struck the CEO of this airline, in his own cabin, on his own aircraft, in front of witnesses and recording devices." A pause that felt geological in its weight. "I don't know what you thought was going to happen here. I genuinely do not know. But when we land, you need to have a lawyer, not a union rep, a lawyer." She heard him distantly, like the words were coming through water. "And Sandra." His voice dropped another register. "Whatever you said to him up there, whatever words you used, I need you to understand something. That man just lost his wife 14 months ago. He is on this flight alone with a 4-month-old son. And you—" He stopped himself. When he continued, his voice was controlled, but barely. "I don't know how this ends for you, but I know how it starts. And it starts the moment you put your hand on that passenger." The line went quiet. Sandra held the phone against her ear long after Hadley had hung up. She could hear the low, constant note of the aircraft around her, the engines, the pressurized air, the mechanical hum of 37,000 feet of nothing between her and whatever was waiting on the ground. She thought about something Kevin had said. The way you look at certain passengers. The way you decide before they open their mouths what category they go in. She had been doing this job for 11 years. She had told herself thousands of times that she read people well, that she knew the difficult ones before they spoke, that her instincts were reliable. Standing in the galley of Flight 147, she wondered for the first time in a very long time whether what she'd called instinct was something else entirely, something she hadn't looked at directly in a long time, because it was more comfortable not to. Daniel was not thinking about Sandra Kowalski. He was thinking about a board meeting he had scheduled for Thursday morning and whether the agenda needed restructuring. He was thinking about a route expansion proposal his VP of strategy had sent him 3 days ago that he hadn't fully reviewed yet. He was thinking in the specific compartmentalized way that had served him his entire professional life about the 14 separate threads of responsibility he was currently holding. He was also in an entirely different part of himself, the part that never fully clocked out the part that was always and only a father listening to his son breathe. The man from row 4, the one with the wire-rimmed glasses, leaned slightly across the aisle. "Mind if I ask you something?" he said. Daniel looked over. "Go ahead." "You didn't raise your voice once." The man said it with a kind of wondering directness, the way someone names a thing they've been sitting with. "Through all of that, you never once raised your voice." Daniel thought about this for a moment. "Raising my voice wouldn't have helped Noah." The man was quiet. Then, "That's a good answer." "It's a true answer," Daniel said. "There's a difference." The man nodded slowly. He extended his hand across the aisle. "Roy Tillman." Daniel took it. "Daniel Harmon." Roy studied him for a moment. Not with the calculating look that Gerald had used, not with Sandra's categorizing assessment. With simple, direct attention. "I've got grandchildren," Roy said. "2 of them. My daughter does it alone too. Her husband well." He shook his head slightly. "It's not easy what you're doing." "No," Daniel agreed. "You're doing it well, though." Roy glanced at Noah. "He looks like he feels safe." Daniel looked down at his son. Something tightened in his chest, not painfully, but the way something tightens when it's true and tender and almost too much to hold. "That's the whole job," he said quietly. "That's everything." Roy gave him a nod that carried more in it than most speeches, then settled back in his seat and returned to his book. Daniel turned back to the window. Below them, the cloud cover had thinned slightly, and he could see the geometry of the earth far beneath the patchwork of fields and roads and the long silver thread of a river cutting through it all. His phone buzzed. A text from Christine Yao. "HR and legal are briefed. Security ops will meet you at the jet bridge. Captain's been notified. Full cabin recording secured. Anything else you need?" He typed back, "No, thank you." Then after a moment he added, "Find out if Kowalski has kids." Christine's response came quickly. 2. A boy 14, a girl 11. Daniel looked at that for a long time. He thought about what it meant to be someone's parent. To be the person another human being needed to believe was good. To have that be a fact about you, not an aspiration. A fact that you carried into every room, every decision, every ordinary moment of an ordinary day. He thought about what those two kids were going to find out about their mother before this week was over. He put the phone down. The anger he felt, and he felt it clean and cold, and entirely justified, did not go away. But something sat beside it. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something more like recognition. The same recognition he tried to bring to every hard decision his company had ever required of him, that consequences fell further than the people who deserved them. He would hold Sandra Kowalski accountable, completely and without wavering. He would do the same with every member of the crew who had failed in their responsibility today. But he was not going to enjoy it. He looked at Noah's sleeping face. "Okay," he said very quietly, whether to his son, or to himself, or to Claire. Wherever Claire was, he couldn't have said exactly. "Okay." The aircraft flew on through the white, indifferent sky. 2 more hours to Los Angeles. 2 more hours before the doors opened and the consequences that had been quietly assembling at 37,000 feet finally came to Earth. The cabin was very still. Gerald Mitch had not moved from his seat. The woman across the aisle had put away her tablet entirely and appeared to be sleeping or performing sleep. Kevin Marsh had not returned to first class. And Sandra Kowalski stood alone in the galley, thinking about categories. It was Roy Tillman who noticed it first. He had gone back to his book, or tried to, but his eyes kept going to the galley partition. Something about the quality of the silence coming from that direction was different now. He'd flown enough miles to know what a normal flight sounded like, and what a flight with something wrong in it sounded like. He watched from behind the top of his book as Kevin Marsh came back through from the economy cabin and paused at the galley entrance. Said something quietly. Got no audible response. Went in. Then came out again. 2 minutes later, his face arranged very carefully the way a face gets arranged when a person is working hard to project normalcy over something that is not normal at all. Roy looked at Daniel, who was looking out his window. He thought about what Daniel had said. That's the whole job. That's everything. Roy Tillman had been a county judge in Georgia for 22 years before he'd retired. He'd sent people to prison and kept people out of prison and sat with evidence for weeks before making decisions that would define entire lives. He knew what it looked like when a situation was still unfolding, when the visible part of it was just the surface. He folded the corner of his book page down, settled back in his seat, and waited. Because whatever was coming when this plane touched down in Los Angeles, Roy had a feeling it was going to be something he'd tell his grandchildren about for a very long time. The last 90 minutes of Flight 1147 passed the way the final hours before a verdict always pass, with a heaviness that had nothing to do with time, and everything to do with the knowledge that something irrevocable was coming. Daniel had stopped writing in his notebook. Everything he needed was documented. 16 pages front and back in his precise, unhurried handwriting, the kind of record that held up in rooms where things needed to hold up, He capped the pen, closed the notebook, and tucked it back into the diaper bag beside the remaining formula bottles and the spare onesie and the small stuffed bear that had belonged to Claire, and that he had packed without conscious decision on every trip he'd taken since she died. Noah was awake now, not fussing, just awake doing the thing infants do, where they stare at a fixed point with the philosophical intensity of someone solving a problem the rest of the world hasn't noticed yet. Daniel held him against his chest, facing outward, letting the boy look at whatever he wanted to look at. What Noah appeared to want to look at was Gerald Mitch in row 5. Gerald became aware of this after about 30 seconds. He shifted in his seat, looked out his window, looked back. The baby was still staring. Gerald cleared his throat and opened his phone again, then appeared to remember that his phone had become a source of distress rather than comfort over the past 90 minutes and put it face down on his tray table. Roy Tillman, watching this from row 4, permitted himself a very small smile and said nothing. It was Kevin Marsh who broke the surface tension of the cabin first. He came through the galley partition with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who had made a decision and was going to carry it out before he could unmake it. He walked directly to seat 3A and stopped. Daniel looked up. "Mr. Harmon," Kevin said. His voice was steady, but there was something working underneath it, something that was costing him effort to keep in check. "I owe you an apology." Daniel waited. "I was in the galley when the incident occurred. I heard it. I didn't intervene." Kevin's jaw tightened. "That was wrong. Regardless of who you are. It was wrong because it was wrong, and I want to say that to you directly." Daniel studied him for a moment. "Why didn't you—" Kevin looked like he'd been hoping the question wouldn't come in exactly that form. "Because she's been the lead on this cabin for 6 years, he said. "Because I've learned over time that getting in Sandra's way costs you more than it's worth. Because—" He stopped, started again. "Because I made the wrong calculation, and I've been standing in that galley for the last hour thinking about what I watched happen and not stopping it, and I needed to come out here and tell you that." "You told me the truth is coming," Daniel said. "When we land." Kevin blinked. "She told you that?" "She mentioned it. The fact that you told her that mattered." Daniel shifted Noah slightly. "Sit down for a minute, Kevin." Kevin sat in the empty seat across the aisle, the seat that had belonged to the woman with the reading tablet who had at some point in the last hour quietly relocated herself to a different row. "How long has she been doing this?" Daniel asked. Kevin understood what this meant without further specification. He was quiet for a moment, weighing something. Then, "As long as I've known her, which is 4 years." He looked at his hands. "It's not I want to be accurate. She's not a bad person. She works hard. She knows this job inside and out. But there are certain passengers, certain types, and something in her just—" He searched for the right word. "Decides, before she has any real information. She decides. And the crew accommodates it. The crew doesn't challenge it," Kevin said, which was a distinction, and they both knew it. "There's a difference. Not much of one from the seat I'm in." "No," Kevin agreed quietly. "Not much of one." Daniel nodded slowly. He was not, Kevin noticed, writing any of this down. He was listening with the kind of complete, undivided attention that was, in Kevin's experience, rare in people with the kind of authority Daniel carried. Most people at that level listened while simultaneously cataloging their response. Daniel Harmon just listened. "The passenger who complained," Daniel said. "Gerald. Gerald Mitch. He's a Platinum Elite member. Flies with us maybe 40 times a year. Sandra knows him. They have—" Kevin considered his phrasing. "An understanding. He complains, she acts on it. He leaves good reviews. He's done it before." "Done what before?" Kevin met his eyes. Complained about passengers he didn't think belonged in the front cabin. The words settled between them with the weight of something that had been waiting to be said for a long time in a room where nobody said it. Okay, Daniel said. I thought you should know. I already knew, Daniel said. Not harshly, as a simple fact. I could see it the moment she walked up the aisle, the way she looked at me. He paused. I've been on a lot of flights, Kevin. I've sat in a lot of cabins. I know what it looks like when someone has decided something about you before you've opened your mouth. Kevin nodded. He looked like a man sitting inside a truth he wished were smaller. You're going to be interviewed when we land, Daniel said. Tell them what you told me, all of it, including Gerald. I know. And Kevin. Daniel waited until the man looked up. The fact that you came out here, that you said this to my face, instead of deciding it was easier not to, I want you to know I see that. It doesn't fix what happened, but I see it. Kevin Marsh had been a flight attendant for 9 years. He had received compliments from passengers and complaints from passengers, and had been thanked in notes and reviewed in surveys, and had on 3 occasions been formally recognized by the airline for outstanding service. None of those moments felt precisely like this one. Thank you, he said. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He went back to the galley. Sandra had been in the forward lavatory. Not hiding, she told herself firmly and repeatedly that she was not hiding, that she had simply needed a moment of privacy to collect herself, to think through what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. She had run cold water over her wrists, which she'd learned somewhere helped with anxiety, though she could not right now remember where. She had looked at her own face in the small mirror above the sink. She had looked at it for a long time. The face that looked back at her was 51 years old. It had laugh lines and a small scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood fall, and the particular tiredness of someone who had been doing a physically demanding job for over a decade. It was her face. She knew it the way you know a thing you've lived behind your entire life. She tried to remember the exact moment she had made the decision to do what she'd done. She kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. There hadn't been a moment. There hadn't been a decision exactly. It had been more like a motion she was already in the middle of before she'd consciously chosen to begin it. Like the doing of it had preceded the thinking of it by just enough to make it possible. She thought that was probably important. She thought it probably said something she hadn't been willing to look at directly. She came out of the lavatory and walked back to the galley. Kevin was there, standing by the coffee station, looking at her with the expression he'd been wearing since the incident, that complicated, sad, not quite accusatory look that was somehow worse than anger would have been. He wants me to tell the truth when we land, Kevin said. I know. All of it, including Gerald. She absorbed this. Gerald's been a good customer for you, Sandra. Kevin's voice was not unkind. It was just done with the conversation she was trying to have. Gerald Mitch has been using you for years to do something that you should have recognized a long time ago. And you let him, because it matched what was already in your head. He paused. I'm not your enemy. I'm saying this because it's true. Sandra put her back against the galley counter. She thought about her daughter Emma, who was 11, and who wanted, with the specific, ferocious certainty of an 11-year-old, to be a veterinarian. She thought about her son Patrick, 14, who had his father's eyes and her stubbornness, and who was at this exact moment, probably in his second period class, arguing with his history teacher about something that Patrick was at least partially right about. She thought about sitting across from them at dinner and explaining this. "What do I do?" she said. She wasn't asking Kevin, not entirely. The words came out aimed at the general air. Kevin was quiet for a moment. Then, the same thing you should have done 2 hours ago. Tell the truth. Captain Hadley called back once more. 40 minutes from LAX, he requested Sandra come to the flight deck door. She stood in the narrow corridor with the door cracked 4 inches and Hadley's voice coming through the gap, low and direct. "I'm going to be landing this aircraft, and then I'm going to be answering for my own part in this," he said, "whatever that looks like." A pause. "I got the initial flag from your cabin note. I logged it as handled, and I moved on. That was insufficient. I should have followed up. Another pause. I'm not asking you for anything, Sandra. I'm just telling you what I'm going to say so it's not a surprise. You're going to say it was insufficient, she repeated. Because it was, he said. And I've been flying 26 years and I know what my responsibility is in that cabin and I dropped it. That's what I'm going to say. She stood there in the narrow corridor. Bill, she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name in years of flying together. I don't know how to... She stopped. I know, he said. And then, with the weariness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for the last 90 minutes, neither do I. The door clicked shut. Sandra walked back to the galley and began the mechanical work of preparing the cabin for descent. Tray tables up. Seatbacks forward. Carry-on items secured. She moved through the first-class cabin doing her job with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times, and she kept her eyes away from Seat 3A, and the man in Seat 3A did not look at her. She stopped at row 5. Gerald Mitch looked up. In 11 years of flying together, Gerald had always met her eyes with a particular expression, comfortable, proprietary, the look of a man who knows he's an asset to the person looking at him. The expression that was there now was different. It was the face of someone who had been making a calculation for 90 minutes and was not confident in the result. Sandra, he said with a sort of careful casualness. Mr. Mitch, she said. She used the formal address deliberately. Please ensure your tray table is in the upright position for landing. Gerald blinked. Of course. He reached for it. Then. Listen. What happened up there with the other passenger? I just want you to know, I didn't intend for things to go as far as, Mr. Mitch? Her voice was flat and final and no longer deferential. I need you to prepare for landing. She moved on before he could respond. She felt him watching her back as she went. She did not turn around. So, the wheels of Flight 147 touched the LAX runway at 11:47 a.m. local time, 6 minutes ahead of schedule, which was the kind of irony the universe sometimes offered when it was in a particularly dark mood. Daniel felt the jolt of contact with the ground and tightened his arm around Noah. The boy had eaten again during descent and was in the groggy, milk-drunk state that Daniel privately thought of as the most peaceful thing in the known universe. He was warm and heavy against Daniel's chest and smelled like formula and the faint, irreplaceable scent that was just Noah, just his son. The smell he had memorized the first hour of the boy's life, and that he suspected he would be able to identify in a dark room for the rest of his life. We're down, buddy, he said quietly. We're down. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Daniel's phone, which he'd switched off airplane mode, began to receive the accumulated messages of a man whose company had been for the last 3 hours operating without him at the helm. He scrolled through them without opening most of them. One from Christine team is assembled at the gate. Security Ops HR Legal. Captain's awareness confirmed. Ready when you are. One from his assistant Marcus Board has been notified of a brief delay to Thursday's meeting. Media relations is on standby. The cabin recordings are already circulating on social. We have 3 major outlets requesting comment. One from the head of legal, a woman named Patricia Voss, who had been with the company for 8 years and who Daniel trusted completely. Ready. This is airtight. He looked at the last one for a moment. 3 major outlets. The recordings were already circulating. He hadn't planned for it to go public. He had planned for accountability, swift and complete, conducted through the proper internal channels. But he understood with the particular clarity of someone who had spent 12 years understanding how information moved that it was out of his hands now. It had been out of his hands the moment the first phone had come up in that cabin. The question was not whether this story would be told. The question was what shape it took when it landed. He typed back to Marcus, "No comment until I'm off the plane. Tell media relations to say we are aware of the incident. We take it with the utmost seriousness, and a full statement will be forthcoming. Nothing else." Marcus Dunn. Daniel pocketed the phone as the aircraft reached the gate and the seatbelt sign chimed off. Around him, passengers began the familiar choreography of retrieval, overhead bins, carry-ons, the organized chaos of 200 people attempting to exit a metal tube simultaneously. In first class, there were fewer people and less chaos, but the same energy underneath it, the particular relief of arrival of ground beneath feet of the flight being over. Roy Tillman pulled his bag from the overhead bin and looked at Daniel. "I hope," Roy said, "that what comes next is fair." "It'll be thorough," Daniel said. "I can promise you that much." Roy nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, the simple, unadorned card of a retired man, just a name and a phone number. "If you need a witness who has no stake in the outcome," he said, "I saw what I saw. I'll say what I saw." Daniel took the card. "Thank you, Roy." Roy looked at Noah one last time. "He's going to be okay," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Daniel said. "He is." Roy moved toward the front of the aircraft. Daniel stayed seated, waiting for the cabin to clear. He was in no hurry. He knew what was waiting at the jet bridge, and he knew what came after that, and he had learned a long time ago that rushing toward consequences never improved them. Gerald Mitch passed his row without looking at him. Moving fast eyes forward, the particular walk of a man who hopes that if he moves quickly enough, the situation behind him won't catch up. It would catch up. Daniel had already made sure of that. When the cabin was nearly empty, Daniel stood. He settled Noah into the carrier. He'd packed a soft, structured thing that he'd spent 2 weeks researching before Noah was born, because he had researched everything, had approached fatherhood the way he approached every challenge, with the combination of total preparation and the quiet acknowledgement that no amount of preparation was ever quite enough. He buckled the straps, checked the positioning felt. Noah settled against his chest with the trusting weight of the entirely safe. He picked up the diaper bag. He picked up the small leather notebook. He walked toward the front of the aircraft. Kevin Marsh was standing near the galley door. He met Daniel's eyes as he passed. He didn't say anything. Daniel gave him a brief nod, the kind that contains more than words usually manage, and moved on. Sandra Kowalski was standing at the aircraft door. It was protocol, the lead flight attendant stationed at the door, for deplaning the final representative of the crew for each departing passenger. She had done this thousands of times. She had said goodbye to thousands of passengers, the pleasantries automatic and smooth, the face arranged into professional warmth. She was not arranged into professional warmth now. She was standing at the door with her hands at her sides and an expression that had over the course of 3 hours traveled a very long distance from where it had started. Daniel stopped in front of her. They were face to face for the first time since she had hit him. She could see the mark on his cheek, fainter now than it had been, but there. It would be visible in photographs. She knew that. She had known it in a cold, specific way for the last 2 hours. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Daniel said quietly, "I need you to know something." Sandra waited. "What you did today, the assumptions you made, the way you acted on them, the consequences that are coming, all of that is on you. I'm not going to minimize it, and I'm not going to excuse it." He held her gaze. "But I also need you to know that what happens next is about accountability, not punishment for its own sake. There's a difference, and I believe in that difference. I want you to understand that going in." Sandra's throat moved. Something in her face shifted, not breaking exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because someone told me something similar once," Daniel said. "When I made a decision early in my career that I shouldn't have. Someone sat across from me and told me the difference between accountability and punishment, and it was the most useful thing anyone said to me in that entire year." He paused. "I'm not forgiving you, Sandra. I want to be clear. But I'm also not going to pretend you aren't a person." He stepped past her to the jet bridge. Behind him, Sandra Kowalski put her hand on the doorframe and held it there like she needed something to hold on to, and stared at the empty cabin of Flight 147. Outside, at the end of the jet bridge, Daniel could already see them, Christine Yao, in a charcoal blazer, flanked by two members of the security operations team, and a woman he recognized as Patricia Voss from legal. Behind them, a man from HR, whose name he was about to learn. Beyond them, the terminal, the ordinary, indifferent, fluorescent-lit territory of an ordinary airport morning. Daniel walked toward them. Noah nestled against his chest, reached up with one small hand, and closed it around the collar of Daniel's shirt, the way he always did. The way that meant simply, I'm here, and you're here, and that's enough. Daniel put his hand over his son's hand, and walked forward into whatever came next. Christine Yao had worked for Daniel Harmon for 8 years, and in that time she had seen him walk into rooms that other people walked out of. She had watched him sit across from hostile board members and hostile regulators, and one particularly hostile senator who had spent 45 minutes trying to dismantle a route expansion proposal that Daniel had spent 6 months building. She had never once seen him blink first. What she had not seen, what nobody in the professional orbit of Daniel Harmon had seen, was him walking off an aircraft with an infant strapped to his chest and a mark on his face that a camera could pick up from 15 feet away. She closed the distance between them at the end of the jet bridge quickly, efficiently, the way Christine did everything. Daniel. She searched his face, the mark on his cheek, then Noah, then back to his face. Is Noah? We're fine, he said. The same words he'd said to her on the phone 3 hours ago, but they landed differently now here on solid ground. He's good. He ate twice. Christine exhaled something she'd been holding since the phone call. Then she shifted back into operational mode because operational mode was Christine Yao's natural habitat, and it was where Daniel needed her right now. Patricia is here, and Jared from HR, and we have 2 from security ops. The captain and Kowalski are being held in separate areas per the protocol you requested. Gerald Mitch was flagged at the gate. He's in a private room with one of our airport representatives. Daniel nodded. Media. 3 outlets have the cabin footage. It's been running for about 40 minutes. Social is significant. Christine paused, which was notable because Christine Yao almost never paused. Daniel, it's very significant. How significant? The clip of the slap has 4 million views. He absorbed this without visible reaction. And the full context. Building. The longer videos are starting to circulate. Some passengers posted extended recordings that include your phone call. The name is out. It's been confirmed by 3 separate sources in the last hour, none of them us. She held his gaze. This is not something we can manage quietly anymore. I know, he said. He'd known it from the moment he'd seen the first phone come up in that cabin. It was never going to be quiet. The question is whether it's accurate. Then we need you on the record soon. We will be. He shifted Noah slightly in the carrier, checked the straps with automatic parental habit. First things first. Where's Patricia? Patricia Voss was 53, small, with reading glasses she wore on a chain, and the general demeanor of a woman who found other lawyers exhausting. She had a legal mind that Daniel genuinely considered one of the sharpest he'd encountered in 20 years in business, and she communicated with the economy of someone who understood that every word either built a case or didn't. She was standing 6 feet away, and she came forward now. Patricia. Daniel. She looked at the mark on his face with the specific attention of someone cataloging evidence rather than expressing sympathy, which was exactly what Daniel needed her to do. I need 10 minutes with you before you speak to anyone else, and I need to see the notebook. He handed it to her. She opened it, scanned the first 3 pages with the fast-absorbing read of someone used to processing documents under pressure, and nodded once. This is good, she said. This is very good. She looked up. I also spoke with a Roy Tillman in the last 15 minutes. He called in voluntarily, said he got our main number from the airport information desk. He's prepared to give a full witness statement. Daniel thought about Roy and his wire-rimmed glasses and his uncomplicated nod. "Use him," he said. "Already scheduled." Patricia clicked her pen. "The cabin recording is the cornerstone. What's in your notebook corroborates it precisely. The witness statements will build the walls. Gerald Mitch is a problem we can address separately. His history of complaints filed through Kowalski specifically is documented in our system going back 3 years. Christine pulled it this morning." Daniel looked at Christine. 47 complaints, Christine said. 31 of them resulted in crew action of some kind. 22 of those 31 involved passengers who were demographically consistent. She said the last word carefully, precisely. "Consistent," Daniel repeated. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Not processing, he'd processed this the moment Kevin Marsh had told him about Gerald and Sandra's arrangement at 37,000 feet. He was deciding the right shape for what he was about to say. "Pull all 47, he said. "I want the full record. I want to know which crew members acted, which supervisors signed off, and which complaints came back to us at the corporate level and how they were handled." He paused. "Or not handled." Christine was already typing. "And Gerald Mitch's Platinum Elite status," Daniel said. "Suspended pending the review, effective immediately." Christine looked up briefly. "His annual spend is—" "I know what his annual spend is, Christine." She nodded and went back to typing. Patricia closed the notebook and held it carefully. "I need to brief you on the legal exposure before we go any further. 5 minutes." They stepped to the side of the corridor, away from the flow of deplaning passengers from the economy cabin, now streaming past. Daniel stood with Noah against his chest and listened to Patricia lay out the landscape in the precise, unadorned way she always did, what the liability picture looked like, what the criminal exposure for Kowalski was independent of whatever SkyPoint did, what the company's obligation was to the remaining crew members, what the board would need from him before end of day. He listened without interrupting, which was another thing people who knew him had learned, was just how he operated. He didn't perform attention. He gave it. When Patricia finished, he said, "Kevin Marsh." She checked her notes. "The second flight attendant. He came to me voluntarily during the flight. He told me what he saw and what he didn't do and why. He also told me he'd tell the truth on the ground. He did both." Daniel adjusted Noah's position. "He's not the problem. Don't make him one." Patricia made a note. "Understood." Captain Hadley notified operations of the incident flag, but failed to follow up with the cabin directly. The question is whether that constitutes a failure of duty or a procedural gap. "What's your read?" Patricia took her glasses off, cleaned them with a deliberate motion that Daniel knew meant she was being careful. "I think Hadley is a 26-year veteran who made the error of trusting a subordinate's assessment in a moment when he should have verified it himself. I think he knows it. And I think the way he responds in the next 48 hours will tell us whether that was a lapse or a pattern." "Interview him today," Daniel said. "I want his full account before I make any decisions about his status." "He's in room 2. I can have that scheduled in the next 20 minutes. "Good." Patricia put her glasses back on. Sandra Kowalski. The name sat between them for a moment. "I spoke to her at the aircraft door," Daniel said. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "I told her the difference between accountability and punishment," he said. Patricia studied him. She had known Daniel Harmon for 8 years, had watched him make decisions under pressure that most CEOs would have needed a committee and a 2-week retreat to arrive at, and she had learned to recognize the moments when he was telling her something that would affect her strategy. "What did you mean by that?" she asked in the tone of someone who wants the precise answer. "I meant that I want full accountability. I want what happened in that cabin documented, investigated, and acted on completely and without equivocation. I want the systemic issues, the Gerald arrangement, the complaint history. Whatever culture produced a situation where a flight attendant felt she could put her hand on a passenger, I want all of it surfaced and addressed." He held Patricia's gaze. I do not want this to become a public spectacle designed to destroy a person. There's a version of this story that becomes about humiliation. I don't want that version. That may not be within your control, Patricia said carefully. The media? The media will do what the media does. I can't control that. I can control what we say and how we say it and what shape the accountability takes inside this company. He paused. She has 2 kids. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That doesn't change the legal... I know it doesn't, Daniel said. I'm not saying it changes anything about consequences. I'm saying it changes how I think about the purpose of those consequences. Kowalski needs to be held accountable. Fully. And she is going to be. But I'm not in the business of destroying people, Patricia. I'm in the business of fixing systems that let people make the choices she made. Patricia looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote something in her notepad, capped her pen, and said, All right, let me tell you how we build that. Yeah. Jared Kim from HR was 29 years old and had been with SkyPoint for 3 years and had never in those 3 years been part of anything like this. He had prepared his documentation carefully. The crew files, the complaint history. Christine had pulled the relevant policy sections on passenger conduct and crew authority and physical contact, and he had organized it into a folder that he was now holding with both hands in the small private room where they'd set up the operational base. When Daniel walked in, Jared stood up immediately, then wasn't sure if he should have, then sat back down, then stood again. Daniel looked at him. Sit down, Jared. It's all right. Jared sat. Mr. Harmon, I want to say on behalf of the HR department, on behalf of all of us, that what happened on that flight was completely unacceptable, and we are fully committed to... Thank you, Daniel said not unkindly. Tell me about the complaint history. Jared opened the folder, with the focus of someone grateful to have something concrete to do. So, what Christine pulled this morning. The 47 complaints filed by Gerald Mitch in the 3 years he's been flagged as a Kowalski-adjacent complainant, we cross-reference those against crew action logs, and the pattern is... He paused. It's not subtle, Mr. Harmon. 22 incidents where the passenger complained about was subsequently moved, downgraded, or removed from a service. In 17 of those 22, the passenger description in the original complaint included demographic identifiers that weren't relevant to the stated conduct issue. Daniel looked at him steadily. Meaning Gerald Mitch described what people looked like when it wasn't relevant to what he was complaining about. Jared's voice was careful and precise. And in every one of those 17 cases, the affected passenger was a person of color. The room was quiet. Who signed off on the crew actions? Daniel said. In most cases, Kowalski as lead. In 6 cases, there's a supervisor countersignature. 2 different supervisors. Jared turned a page. Both still with the company, both based out of Atlanta. Daniel looked at Christine. I have their names, Christine said. Add them to the review, Daniel said. Full scope. I want to know who knew what and when. He turned back to Jared. How far does this go? Is this isolated to this crew, this route? Jared hesitated. Honestly, Mr. Harmon, I don't know yet. To do a full analysis, we'd need to go through complaint data company-wide cross-referenced against crew action, and it's a significant undertaking. How long? If we dedicate a full team to it, 2 weeks for a preliminary picture, 4 to 6 weeks for a comprehensive report. Start today, Daniel said. Pull whoever you need. This is the priority. Jared made a note with the handwriting of someone whose hands were slightly unsteady. Yes, sir. Daniel looked at his son. Noah had fallen asleep again in the carrier, lulled by the movement, and the voices, and the warmth. Daniel put a hand on the back of the boy's head, a gesture so automatic and complete, it seemed to happen outside of any conscious direction. Jared, he said without looking up from Noah. I'm going to ask you something and I need a straight answer. Yes, sir. In your 3 years here, in your work, have you seen this before? Not this specifically. The pattern. Jared was quiet for a moment that was one beat longer than a polite pause. It was the beat of a person deciding to tell the truth when a comfortable answer was also available. "Yes," he said. "I've seen versions of it. Not always this explicit, but yes." Daniel nodded slowly. "Why didn't it get escalated?" Another pause. "Because the people who noticed it weren't sure they had enough to make the case. And because making the case in a company this size, the cost of being wrong is significant. So people waited for more evidence, and more evidence didn't always come in a form that was easy to document. Until today." "Until today," Jared agreed. Daniel looked at him. "The cost of being wrong is significant," he repeated. "And the cost of being silent." Jared looked at the folder in his hands. "Apparently this," he said quietly. "Apparently this." Daniel agreed. He straightened. "You've done good work today, Jared. The preparation you brought in here that matters. Now I need you to bring that same work to the full review, and I need it done right. Not fast, right." "Understood," Jared said, and he meant it in a way that went deeper than the procedural. The interview with Captain Hadley took 22 minutes. Hadley came into the room the way he'd done everything in 26 years of flying steadily, with the bearing of a man who understood that carrying himself well was not the same as performing confidence. He sat across from Daniel and Patricia, and he put both hands flat on the table in front of him, and he told the truth. He told it without embellishment and without defense, in the way of someone who had been sitting with it for 3 hours at altitude and had arrived at the ground already knowing what he was going to say. He acknowledged the call from operations about the incident flag. He acknowledged logging it as handled without verifying with the cabin himself. He said he should have called the lead FA directly and assessed the situation independently. He said he'd known Sandra Kowalski for 6 years and had in that time developed a reliance on her judgment that had today replaced his own. "Is that something you'd say was a pattern?" Daniel asked, deferring to Kowalski's assessment of cabin situations. Hadley was quiet for a moment. "In my cabin, the lead FA is the authority. That's the structure." He paused. "But I'm the captain. The aircraft is my responsibility. The passengers are my responsibility. When I substitute someone else's judgment for my own, I don't get to keep the responsibility and hand back the authority." He looked at Daniel. "I know what I did wrong. I'm not going to negotiate with it." Daniel studied him. "What did you know about Kowalski's way of handling certain passengers before today?" Hadley's jaw tightened slightly. "I'd seen her be firm with passengers I might have handled differently. I put it down to personality and experience." He paused. "I didn't ask the harder question." "Which is, whether the pattern of who she was being firm with meant something." Hadley looked at the table. "I didn't ask it because asking it would have required me to name something I didn't want to name, and that's—" He stopped. "That's on me." Patricia was writing. Daniel sat with Hadley's answer for a moment. "I appreciate your honesty," Daniel said. "I'm not going to make a decision about your status in this room today. There will be a full review process, and you'll be part of it. Until that's completed, you'll be on administrative ground duty." He held the man's gaze. "That's not a verdict. It's a process. Do you understand the difference?" Hadley looked at him. Something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but the particular quality of a man who has braced for something and found that the thing when it arrived was shaped by something he recognized as fair. "Yes," Hadley said. "I do." "Good." Daniel stood. "William." The use of the first name was deliberate, and Hadley registered it. "The thing you said about not asking the harder question, I'd like you to think about what it would have cost you to ask it, and whether that cost was real or imagined." Hadley nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about nothing else since I got off that plane." "Good," Daniel said again. "That's where it starts." Sandra Kowalski's union representative arrived at 1:15 p.m. His name was Frank Delaney, and he was a compact, efficient man in his 50s who had been representing airline crew members for 20 years, and who had, in 2 decades of this work, developed a clinical calm in situations that would have crumbled less experienced people. He had reviewed the cabin footage, all of it in the car on the way over, and he had arrived knowing that the footage was what it was, which was very bad, and that his job was not to argue with reality, but to ensure that Sandra's rights in the process were respected. Sandra was in a room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and when Frank walked in, she looked at him the way people look at a life preserver after a long time in open water. "Frank," she said. "Sandra." He sat across from her, put his briefcase on the table, and folded his hands. "Tell me everything. In order. Don't editorialize, just what happened." She told him. All of it. More than she'd told Hadley on the intercom, more than she'd told herself in the lavatory mirror. She told him about the first approach to Seat 3A and Gerald's complaint, and the second approach, and the words that had passed between them, and the moment she kept arriving at, and couldn't explain in any way that made sense from the outside or from the inside when her hand had gone forward. Frank listened. He did not interrupt. He did not react visibly. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Was there a physical threat from the passenger?" "No." "Was there any action from the passenger that you interpreted as physically threatening in any way?" "No." "Did the passenger raise his voice at any point during the interaction?" A long pause. "No." Frank nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. "Sandra, I'm going to be honest with you, because that's the only way I know how to do this job. The footage is clear, the witnesses are aligned, and the passenger is who he is. I can ensure that your rights in the review process are protected, and that any disciplinary proceedings follow proper protocol. I can make sure due process is observed completely at every step." He met her eyes. "But what I cannot do, what nobody can do, is make a case that what is on that footage didn't happen." Sandra held his gaze. "I know. The question I need you to think about carefully, and I mean carefully, Sandra, because this decision will shape everything that follows, is how you respond to what's coming. Not legally. As a person. How you engage with the process." Frank's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who had been in these rooms enough times to know that the difference between people who came through them and people who didn't often had less to do with what they'd done and more to do with what they did next. There's a version of what comes next where you fight everything and dispute everything and argue every point. And there's a version where you take responsibility and engage honestly with what happened. He paused. "In my experience, those two paths don't just lead to different legal outcomes. They lead to different people on the other side of them." Sandra looked at the cold cup of coffee in front of her. She thought about Emma, who wanted to be a veterinarian. She thought about Patrick, who had his father's eyes. She thought about Daniel Harmon standing at the aircraft door telling her the difference between accountability and punishment, and not owing her that. "He said something to me," she told Frank. "When I was at the door." Frank waited. "He said he wasn't going to pretend I wasn't a person." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "After everything, he still said that." Frank looked at her for a moment. "What does that mean to you?" She thought about it. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. "It means," she said slowly, "that I have to decide what kind of person I actually am, not what kind of person I told myself I was." She paused. "Those two things, I think they might not have been the same for a long time, and I didn't look at that directly. And now," she gestured at the room, the table, the cold coffee, all of it. "Now I have to." Frank was quiet. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a notepad. "Then let's talk about how you engage with the process," he said. "Honestly." Daniel was in the corridor outside NOAA in the carrier phone in hand when Christine found him with the expression she wore when something required immediate attention. "Media relations needs a decision," she said. It's been 2 hours since we said a statement was forthcoming. The cycle is moving fast. Daniel was looking at his phone, not at emails, at a photo. Claire, 8 months pregnant, laughing at something off camera, her hand on her stomach, the particular unself-conscious joy of someone who doesn't know they're being photographed. He'd taken it on a Tuesday morning in their kitchen. He could still hear the exact sound of the laugh. He looked at it for 3 more seconds. Then he put the phone in his pocket. "Get me a quiet space in 20 minutes, he said to Christine. "I'll write it myself." Christine started moving. She always started moving before the conversation was technically finished, which was one of the many reasons he'd trusted her with everything for 8 years. "Christine." She paused and turned. "After all this is done today, the statement, the interviews, the coordination, I want you to go home." She blinked. "I still have—" "Go home," he said. "Whatever's left we'll keep until tomorrow. You've been running since 6 this morning." He held her gaze. "I mean it." Christine, who had not been told to go home by anyone in 3 years, managed a nod that she kept professionally composed. "All right." "And Christine," his voice dropped slightly, "thank you for picking up on the first ring. Always on the first ring." She made a sound that might, in different lighting, have been the beginning of something she quickly decided not to say. "That's what I'm here for," she said instead, and turned and walked efficiently down the corridor before anything else could happen to her composure. Daniel watched her go. Noah shifted in the carrier, made a small sound, settled again. "I know," Daniel said quietly to his son, to the corridor, to the long chain of this day from its terrible beginning to this moment. "I know." He straightened his shoulders, and he went to write the statement that would tell the world what had happened on Flight 1147, not the version that was already spreading raw and loud and shaped by other people's purposes, but the one that was true and complete and pointed like everything he did toward something beyond the moment itself, toward what came next. The statement took Daniel 19 minutes to write. Christine had found him a small conference room off the main terminal corridor, the kind of utilitarian space that airports kept for operational use, with a folding table and 4 chairs and fluorescent light that made everything look slightly more serious than it already was. Daniel sat with Noah still in the carrier against his chest, a legal pad in front of him, and he wrote the way he always wrote, the things that mattered most, by hand, slowly, with the pen moving only when the thought was complete. He did not write the statement of a CEO managing a crisis. He wrote the statement of a father who had been struck on a commercial flight while holding his 4-month-old son, who happened to also be the CEO of the airline on which it occurred, and who believed that both of those facts were relevant, and neither of them should obscure the other. He wrote about what happened in plain language. He named no one that was Patricia's guidance, and it was right. He described the incident, the response, and the review that was underway. He wrote one paragraph that he spent 11 of his 19 minutes on, the paragraph that said, "What occurred on Flight 1147 was not at its root an incident involving one flight attendant and one passenger. It was the visible surface of something that runs deeper, a pattern of assumption and accommodation that this company failed to identify, failed to challenge, and therefore failed to stop. That changes today. Not because of who I am, because of who our passengers are. Every one of them." He read it back once. He changed 2 words. He handed it to Christine, who read it in 45 seconds and looked up at him. "This is going to move fast," she said. "I know," he said. "Let it." The statement went out at 2:47 p.m. Pacific Time. By 4 p.m., it had been shared 300,000 times. By 6 p.m., the number was past 1 million, and climbing, and every major network had run some version of the story, most of them leading with the cabin footage, the slap, the silence, the phone call, and then cutting to the statement, which several anchors read in full, which almost never happened with corporate statements, because corporate statements were almost never written in language that sounded like a human being had written them. Daniel was not watching any of it. He was in a hotel room 4 miles from LAX, because the original plan had been to drive directly to a meeting in Century City upon landing, and then to his company's West Coast office for 2 days of operational reviews, and all of that had been quietly restructured by Marcus and Christine while he was in the airport. The hotel room had a crib Christine had called ahead, and Daniel had fed Noah and changed him and laid him down and watched the boy fall asleep with the immediate trusting totality that still after 4 months made something in Daniel's chest do a complicated thing. He sat in the chair by the window. The city spread out below in the early evening light, the particular amber sprawl of Los Angeles at dusk. He had his phone in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was thinking about Claire. Not the grief of her, not the stone he carried. Something different. He was thinking about a conversation they'd had maybe 2 years before she got sick. A conversation about a decision he'd made at the company that he'd been uncertain about. A difficult call involving a senior executive who had done something wrong and a board that wanted him handled quietly. "You're going to do the right thing," Claire had said, not a question. "I don't always know what that is," he'd told her honestly. "Yes, you do," she said. "That's not your problem. Your problem is you know what it is, and you're still calculating whether it costs too much." He had thought about that conversation many times over the years. He thought about it now at 39 with his son asleep in a hotel crib and a mark on his cheek, fading from red to a dull ache in a city he hadn't planned to spend the night in. At the end of a day he hadn't planned for at all. She had been right, of course. She was usually right about him in the ways that mattered. He put the phone down on the side table, face up. It buzzed continuously. Board members, colleagues, journalists, routed through media relations, old friends from before the company was what it was now. He looked at the ceiling. "I think today was right," he said to no one, to the room, to wherever Claire was in the architecture of things. "I think it was right. But I wanted you to know I know it cost something. For Kowalski, for Hadley, even for Gerald, probably in some version of the future." He paused. "You'd tell me the cost doesn't change whether it was right. You'd tell me right is right and the accounting comes after." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd be right." Noah made a small sleep sound from the crib. Daniel turned his head to look at him. "She would have loved you so much, buddy," he said. "She would have been so—" He stopped. He let the sentence sit unfinished because some sentences don't need endings to be complete. She would have been so. Patricia Voss called at 8:15 p.m. Daniel picked up on the second ring. "The review board convenes Monday," she said. "I've confirmed with HR Kowalski Hadley and the 2 supervisors flagged in the complaint history. All 4 will be formally interviewed under the process. Union representation confirmed for Kowalski." A pause. "She called me, actually." Daniel straightened slightly. "Kowalski called you." "Her representative did. Frank Delaney, solid guy 20 years in, doesn't waste words." Patricia's voice carried something close to approval, which from Patricia was significant. "He said his client wants to engage with the process honestly and has declined to contest the initial findings. He said—" Patricia paused in the specific way she paused when something had surprised her. "He said Sandra Kowalski asked if she could request through proper channels an opportunity to speak directly with you before the review board concludes. Not to affect the outcome. Just to," he used the word, "complete something." Daniel was quiet. "You don't have to," Patricia said. "In fact, from a purely legal standpoint—" "I know," he said. Daniel. "I'll think about it," he said, and he meant it as a real statement, not a deflection. He would think about it carefully the way he thought about everything that deserved thought. "The complaint history review is moving," Patricia continued. "Jared has a preliminary team assembled 8 people pulling records going back 5 years. He says the early picture is, she chose her words. Not what we'd want it to be." "Tell him to keep going," Daniel said. "All the way through. However long it takes." "He said you'd say that." A pause that might have been the edge of something warmer. He also said, and this isn't strictly legal information. I'm just passing it along, he said. Working on this feels like doing the job he thought he was getting when he applied here 3 years ago. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Tell him I'm glad he stayed. I will. Patricia clicked her pen, her habitual closing gesture. Get some sleep, Daniel. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. Tomorrow is always complicated. Yes, she said. But tomorrow has a board call at 7:3 network interview requests that media relations needs a decision on, and a company-wide communication that we need to get right on the first try. A pause. So perhaps slightly more complicated than most. Good night, Patricia. Good night. The board call at 7 was 12 minutes long, which was for a SkyPoint board call essentially a record. Daniel spoke for 8 of those 12 minutes. He laid out what had happened, what the review process looked like, what the company-wide communication would say, and what structural changes he was putting in motion. A passenger dignity initiative that would require a full overhaul of the complaint and crew action protocols, mandatory bias awareness training for all crew and supervisory staff, and a new independent review panel for passenger grievances that would sit outside the direct chain of crew command. There was a silence when he finished that lasted about 4 seconds, which in a board call is a very long time. Then Eleanor Marsh, the board chair, and a woman who had been in rooms with powerful people for 40 years and was never impressed by power for its own sake, said, "Daniel, what do you need from us?" He said, "I need you to trust the process and let me run it." Another pause. Then Eleanor said, "Done. Next." That was the board call. The company-wide communication went out at 9 a.m., Tuesday, to all 38,000 SkyPoint employees. It was 3 pages. Daniel had written the first 2 pages himself, and Patricia had written the third. The first 2 pages described what had happened, what it meant, and what was changing. The third page outlined the new policies in clear operational language. The first 2 pages began, "I want to talk to you about what happened on Flight 147, and I want to do it directly without the buffer of corporate language, because what happened deserves more than that." The response from employees came in through every channel simultaneously, emails to the executive suite messages, through the internal platform notes passed up through supervisors. The volume of it surprised even Christine, who had been measuring the company's internal temperature for 8 years. The tone of it surprised her more, because it wasn't uniformly supportive in the simple reflexive way that employees often respond to leadership communications. It was more complicated than that. Some of the responses were from employees who said in various words, "I've seen this. I didn't know how to say it. I'm glad it's being said." Some were from employees who were defensive and uncertain and processing. Some were from employees who said they were proud to work here in a way that implied they hadn't been entirely sure of that recently. Christine brought the summary to Daniel on Tuesday afternoon. He read through it for 20 minutes without speaking. "The ones who said they'd seen it," he said finally. "I want a channel. A real one. Not a hotline that routes to a form. Something where they can talk to a person." "I'll build it," Christine said. "Today," Daniel said. "Today," she confirmed. Yay. Roy Tillman gave his witness statement on Tuesday morning in a conference room in Atlanta that a SkyPoint legal representative had arranged. He sat across from a junior attorney and gave his account in the direct, unhurried way of a man who had spent 22 years as a county judge and was constitutionally incapable of approximating when precision was available. He described what he saw in the order he saw it. He described the infant crying and the subsequent quiet. He described Sandra Kowalski's 2 approaches to seat 3A. He described Gerald Mitch's involvement and the words he'd used, including the words Roy had not been close enough to fully hear, which he stated plainly as something he could not confirm, rather than guessing at it, because he was the kind of witness who knew the difference. He described the slap with the specificity of a man who had looked at evidence for 2 decades. He described Daniel Harmon's response. The junior attorney across from him was taking careful notes and managing her professional expression with varying degrees of success. "Mr. Tillman," she said when Roy had finished, "is there anything else you'd like to add to the record?" Roy thought about it for a moment in the genuine, unhurried way the question deserved. "One thing," he said, "and I don't know if it's relevant to your legal purposes, but I'll say it anyway." He folded his hands on the table. "I've watched a lot of people in hard situations over the years, professionally and otherwise. And what I watched that man do on that airplane, the way he handled what was done to him while holding his baby, while staying completely calm, while not once losing his dignity or trying to take anyone else's, that's not something you perform. That's something you are." He paused. "Whatever comes of all this legal process, and I understand the process matters, I just want it on the record somewhere that what that man did in that cabin was the right thing done the right way. And in my experience, that's rarer than it should be." The attorney looked at her notes. Then she looked up at Roy. "Thank you, Mr. Tillman." "You're welcome," Roy said. He stood, shook her hand, and went home to call his daughter and tell her about the flight he'd been on and the man he'd sat next to, because he had a feeling his grandchildren would want to know this story someday. Sandra Kowalski's formal review concluded on the following Friday. The finding was what the evidence required it to be: termination of employment, effective immediately, with documentation of the cause retained in full. Her union representation ensured due process at every step, and every step had been followed completely. Frank Delaney called her after the final meeting. She was at home sitting at her kitchen table when her phone rang. She had told her kids the previous evening, a conversation that had been one of the hardest of her life, and had lasted 2 hours, and had ended with Patrick, 14, with his father's eyes saying, "Mom, I'm not going to pretend I'm not embarrassed. But you're still my mom, and that doesn't change," which was not forgiveness, but was more than she'd let herself hope for. "It's done," Frank said. "Okay," she said. "The request you made to speak with Harmon, I submitted it through Patricia Voss's office." A pause. He agreed. Sandra was quiet for a moment. She had not been certain he would. She wasn't sure given everything that she would have in his position. "When?" she said. "Next week if you're willing. His office will arrange it." Frank's voice was careful. "Sandra, I want to be clear, this is not a legal proceeding. There are no constraints on what's said. It's just 2 people in a room." "I know," she said. "Do you know what you want to say?" She looked at the kitchen table, at the coffee mug Emma had given her for Mother's Day 3 years ago that said "Best Mom" in uneven painted letters, at the grocery list in Patrick's handwriting that was still stuck to the refrigerator because she hadn't been able to bring herself to throw it away, because ordinary things felt very precious right now. "I know the first thing," she said. "The rest—" She paused. "The rest I think I have to find in the room." "All right," Frank said. "I think that's honest." "I'm trying to be," she said. Joshua. The meeting between Daniel Harmon and Sandra Kowalski happened on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after Flight 1147, in a conference room in SkyPoint's Atlanta headquarters. Patricia Voss was present at the door. She had advised Daniel that she did not need to be in the room if he didn't want her there, and he had said he didn't need her in the room, and she had positioned herself outside the door with her briefcase and her reading glasses, and the expression of someone who was absolutely not hovering. Sandra came in alone. She looked different from the woman in the cabin, and the same. The uniform was gone. She was in a dark blazer and slacks, the kind of outfit someone wears when they want to look serious without performing it. She was tired in a way that had settled into her face over the last 10 days, and that Daniel recognized in the way you recognize something in another person that you've worn yourself. She sat down across from him. Daniel had Noah with him. His assistant Marcus had offered to take the baby for the hour, and Daniel had considered it and then decided no. He wasn't sure exactly why. Something about the decision felt right the way some things just did. Sandra looked at Noah, who was awake and regarding her with the serene evaluative attention of a 4-month-old who has not yet learned to be diplomatic about his interest in people. Something crossed her face, something that came and went before it could be identified precisely, but that left a trace in its wake. "He looks like you," she said. "People say that," Daniel said. "I think he looks like his mother." A pause. "I'm sorry," Sandra said. She said it the way it needs to be said to mean anything, without caveat, without the buffer of explanation, without the implicit negotiation of most apologies. Just the two words aimed directly at what they needed to address. "For what I did on that flight, for what I assumed before I did it, for all of it." She held his gaze. "I've been trying to find a way to say that that sounds like enough, and I can't. Because it isn't enough. And I think the honest thing is to say it without pretending it's sufficient, because it isn't." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It isn't sufficient." He said it without cruelty, without edge, just as a fact that the situation required to be named. "But it's true, and that matters more than sufficient." Sandra nodded. She looked at her hands. "I've been thinking about something you said at the aircraft door, about the difference between accountability and punishment." She looked up. "I think for most of my life when I thought about being held responsible for something, I thought about it as punishment, as something being done to me. I never thought about it as something I did to myself by making choices." She paused. "I made choices. For years. And I called them instincts, and I called them experience, and I never looked directly at what they actually were." "What were they?" Daniel asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "Easier than thinking," she said finally. "Easier than asking the harder question. The way someone used that phrase to me recently. The harder question." She looked at Noah. "He deserved better than what I gave him on that flight. You both did. And so did every other passenger She stopped herself. "I'm not going to make a speech about it. I just need you to know I understand what I did. Not just the moment, the pattern that led to the moment." Daniel looked at her for a long time. Not judging, assessing in the careful way of someone who needed to know if the thing in front of him was real. It was real. He could see that. It didn't fix anything, but it was real, and real was where everything that mattered had to start. "I accept the apology," he said, not as a statement that we're even or that what happened is resolved, but as a real thing between two people. I accept it. Sandra exhaled. Something in her shoulders changed. Not relief exactly. Something more like a weight redistributing itself into a shape she could carry. "There's going to be a long process ahead of you," Daniel said. "Legal, professional, personal. All of it." He held her gaze. "I can't make that easier. I wouldn't even if I could. But I want to say one more thing." He paused, making sure the words were right. "The two kids you have. The boy who has your stubbornness, and the girl who wants to be a veterinarian." Sandra went very still. "They're going to watch how you come through what comes next," he said. "And whatever else happens, you have the chance to show them something about what accountability actually looks like when it's real. Not managed. Real." He paused. "That's not nothing, Sandra. That might be everything." Sandra's throat moved. She pressed her lips together. She kept her eyes steady by what was clearly a significant act of will. "Okay," she said, a single quiet word that carried the weight of a decision inside it. Daniel nodded. They sat for another minute without speaking, which was not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind of silence that happens when everything that needs to be said has been said, and the room is holding it. Then Sandra stood. She straightened her jacket. She looked at Noah one more time. The boy looked back at her entirely without judgment, with the complete and democratic curiosity of someone who was new to the world and was still taking everyone in. "He's beautiful," she said. "I mean that." "I know you do," Daniel said. She walked to the door and opened it, and was gone. Outside, Patricia lowered her briefcase and looked at Daniel through the open door. "Well," she said. "It's done," he said. "Is it resolved?" He considered the word. "Resolved implies neat," he said. "It's not neat. People were hurt, systems failed, and what comes next is years of work that might not get finished in my tenure here." He looked at Noah, who was beginning to make the exploratory sounds that preceded the more urgent ones. But something happened in here that needed to happen, and in that room between those two people, it was real, so not resolved, but real. He stood and settled Noah against his chest. Real is where you start. Patricia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, with the economy of a woman who did not waste words, "All right." SkyPoint Airways launched the Passenger Dignity Initiative on the first day of the following month. It was, as these things go, comprehensive. New complaint protocols with independent review, revised crew authority guidelines with clear limits. A full bias awareness curriculum developed in partnership with 3 external organizations that specialized in exactly this kind of institutional work. Jared Kim's 6-week report, when it came, was difficult reading and was made available in summary to the board in full to the review panel and in aggregate anonymized form to the employees. The changes were not universally popular. 3 senior supervisors resigned rather than participate in the new training requirements. One of them, on the way out, said publicly that Daniel Harmon was running a company on sentiment rather than operational logic. Daniel read the quote and thought about it for about 4 seconds, and then went back to work. Kevin Marsh was promoted to lead flight attendant on the Atlanta-Denver route 6 weeks later on the recommendation of his supervisors, and separately on the record, Roy Tillman had noted in his witness statement about the person who had said the right thing when it would have been easier not to. When Kevin received the notification, he sat with it for a long moment at his kitchen table in the early morning quiet of his apartment. He thought about standing in the galley of Flight 147 and watching something happen that he should have stopped. He thought about going out to seat 3A afterward and saying the true thing to Daniel Harmon's face. He thought about the particular arithmetic of those 2 moments, the one he'd failed and the one he'd gotten right, and what it meant that both of them were part of the same story. He accepted the promotion. He called his mother to tell her about it. She said she was proud of him, and he said he wasn't sure he deserved it, and she said those were not the same question, and he should stop confusing them. He thought she was probably right. On a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Flight 147, Daniel Harmon arrived at the SkyPoint headquarters in Atlanta at 7:15 a.m. with Noah in the carrier and the diaper bag over one shoulder and the small leather notebook in his jacket pocket. The security guard at the front desk, a man named Bernard, who had worked the morning shift for 9 years and who had in those 9 years seen every kind of person walk through those doors, nodded at him. "Morning, Mr. Harmon?" "Morning, Bernard." Daniel paused at the desk. "How's your granddaughter doing? The one who was in the spelling bee?" Bernard's face changed the way a face changes when someone unexpected remembers something that matters. "She came in second," he said. "Can you believe it? Second out of the whole county." "I can believe it," Daniel said. "She's got your determination." Bernard laughed, the full, genuine kind. "You have a good day, Mr. Harmon." "You too," Daniel said, and meant it. He walked to the elevator. Noah was looking around with the wide, absorbing attention he brought to everything. These days, the lights, the lobby, the motion. The ordinary, extraordinary fact of a world full of things he hadn't seen yet. Daniel watched his son look at the world and felt the familiar weight and the familiar warmth of what it meant to be the person this boy trusted to carry him through it. The elevator arrived. Daniel stepped in. He was thinking about the board call in 45 minutes and the operations review at 10, and the preliminary findings from Jared's team that were waiting in his inbox. He was thinking about a decision he needed to make by end of week that would affect 800 employees in the Denver hub. He was thinking about 1,000 ordinary, extraordinary things that added up to the weight of what he'd chosen to carry and the responsibility of choosing to carry it well. He was also thinking about a gray Henley, and a plain seat on a flight he hadn't expected, and a slap that had shattered a silence at 37,000 feet, and what had come out of that shattering, not easily, not cleanly, not in the neat resolved way of stories that have decided their own endings, but truly. Genuinely. In the slow, real, irreversible way of things that actually change. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor. Daniel Harmon walked out. His son pressed his small fist against Daniel's chest right over his heart, exactly as he always did. The same gesture every time that meant, I'm here and you're here, and that's enough. It was enough. And Daniel Harmon, who had built something real from almost nothing, who had loved and lost and kept going, who had sat in seat 3A on flight 147 and refused through everything to become anything less than who he was, walked forward into the day. The story did not end there because real stories never end neatly in a single moment. But something was finished. Something had been broken, and something new had grown from the breaking the way real things do, quietly, imperfectly, and for keeps. And that was enough. That was everything.